8th century Tibet. A cave in the mountains. A woman sits in meditation, completely motionless as her body begins to dissolve. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Tibetan accounts describe witnesses seeing her physical form transform into rainbow light, dissolving until only hair and nails remained. The woman? A child bride traded like property at age 13, who became one of the masters who preserved Tibetan Buddhism from extinction. Her name was Yeshe Tsogyal, and she might be one of the most important figures in the survival of Tibetan Buddhism that most people in the West have never heard of. This is her story. In our last video, we told you about Padmasambhava, the master who brought Buddhism to Tibet and transformed its demons into guardians. At the end of that story, we said one person deserved her own episode, because without her, the story of Tibetan Buddhism would be incomplete. But there's a part of that story most people never hear. The woman who ensured those teachings survived. Tibetan tradition holds that Yeshe Tsogyal is a manifestation of Tara, the goddess we covered in a previous video, an emanation of enlightened wisdom taking human form. The mythology matters, but the human story is even more powerful. Padmasambhava brought the teachings. Yeshe Tsogyal made sure they survived. She was his primary disciple, consort, and spiritual partner in the Vajrayana tradition. In Tibet, revered as the Mother of Tibetan Buddhism, monasteries across Tibet honor her, prayers invoke her name, children learn her story. Outside Tibetan Buddhism, far fewer people know her name. Here's how Tibetan masters describe it. Padmasambhava brought the lamp. Yeshe Tsogyal made sure it never went out. But her story doesn't start with enlightenment. It starts with a miracle that led to a nightmare. Legend says she wasn't born like other children. She emerged from a lotus flower in a sacred lake near Drakta in the Kharchen Valley of Tibet. Traditional accounts place her birth around 757 CE, near that same lake in eastern Tibet. Her parents named her Tsogyal, ocean-born queen, after prophetic dreams that she would become a great spiritual teacher. She was born into nobility, protected, educated, privileged. But prophecy doesn't protect you from politics. By age 13, she was being traded to prevent a war. Two powerful chieftains want to marry her, Namkhai Nyingpo and Kyachok Tsultrim. Both refusing to back down, their rivalry escalating, civil war brewing over possession of this girl. King Trisong Detsen intervenes. I'll take her myself to prevent bloodshed. She's brought to Samye Palace as one of his queens, polygamous court, where political intrigue hides behind silk curtains and incense smoke. Imagine being 13 years old, pulled from your family, brought to a palace full of strangers, told you're now property of the king to prevent men from killing each other over you. You're treated well, fed, clothed, given luxury, educated. But luxury doesn't erase powerlessness. We don't know what she felt those first nights at Samye, the fear, the loneliness, the rage at having no say in her own life. But traditional sources tell us she wanted out. She doesn't accept her fate quietly. She requests to dedicate her life to spiritual practice instead. The king refuses. She's too valuable politically. She persists, argues, negotiates. Then, everything changes. One day, a wild-looking yogi arrives at the palace, hair in dreadlocks, eyes like lightning, dressed in rags but radiating absolute authority. Padmasambhava, the master from our last video. He looks at King Trisong Detsen and says, I need your most prized possession for my spiritual work. Give me the queen. The king agrees. Later accounts describe what changed her mind. Not Padmasambhava's authority, but recognition. He looked at her not as property, not as a prize, not as a political tool, but as someone capable of enlightenment. For the first time in her life, someone saw her potential instead of her usefulness. She accepts. And this is where Yeshe Tsogyal's real life begins. Padmasambhava takes her as his primary disciple, consort, and spiritual partner in the Vajrayana tradition. She resists at first, of course she does. Another man, another claim. But he offers something completely different. Become my student. I'll teach you to be free, not from me but from yourself, from suffering, from limitation, from death itself. In Tantric Buddhism, this relationship is spiritual practice itself, not romantic, not possessive, but mutual transformation through advanced practices. She accepts. And then, she disappears. Tibetan tradition holds that for 12 years, Yeshe Tsogyal retreats to Tidro Cave high in the mountains. Alone, isolated, training. Tidro isn't some comfortable monastery. Stone floor, thin air, freezing winters where breath turns to ice, scarce food, complete solitude. Most practitioners break in 12 days. Traditional sources say she endured 12 years. Winter at Tidro. High altitude, temperature far below freezing. No fire, no blankets, just stone walls pressing in and meditation. Later biographies recount one night when the cold became deadly, her body weakening. She could freeze before dawn. She generates tumo, inner heat through breath and visualization. Nyingma accounts say her body temperature rose so high that snow melted in a circle around her meditation seat. She didn't just survive the night, she mastered it. But the harder test wasn't cold, it was silence. 12 years with no human contact. The hunger that makes hands shake, the darkness that makes minutes feel like months, facing every fear, every doubt, every limitation inside her own mind until the mind itself steadies. Traditional sources describe her mastering practices that take most people lifetimes. Tomo, Fohwa, consciousness transference, dream yoga, tantric transformation. The texts speak of her developing siddhis, spiritual powers. Whether literal or symbolic, they represent complete mastery over mind and reality. After years of practice, something shifts. She's not just learning anymore, she's teaching, guiding other practitioners, writing down what she's discovered. Padmasambhava himself, later sources tell us, acknowledges her. I recognize you as a realized master in your own right. Later sources preserve his teaching to her. The basis for realizing enlightenment is a human body. Male or female, there is no great difference. But if she develops the mind bent on enlightenment, the woman's body is better. In 8th century Tibet, where women were property, traded like cattle, this recognition was revolutionary. And here's what makes her indispensable to Padmasambhava's mission. He's a foreigner, Indian, understanding Buddhism perfectly, but not Tibet itself. Yeshe Tsogyal, Tibetan, born from a Tibetan lake. She knows the land, the spirits, the people, the language, the culture. She helped those teachings take root in Tibetan soil. Padmasambhava plants Buddhism in Tibet. Yeshe Tsogyal makes it grow. Nyingma tradition describes both Padmasambhava and Yeshe Tsogyal having multiple spiritual consorts, including practitioners like Atsara Sele, using these tantric relationships to accelerate mutual realization. Then Padmasambhava gives her the mission that will define everything. I'm bringing Buddhism to Tibet. The teachings are here. The monasteries are being built. But you're going to ensure the lineage survives when we're both dead. And she begins by building the infrastructure for Buddhism's survival. In our last video, we told you how Padmasambhava subdued Tibet's demons. Pehar, Nyanchen Tangalha, Tsiu Marpo, transforming them into Buddhism's protectors. But subduing demons and building a preservation network are two separate missions. Padmasambhava sends her across Tibet, Bhutan, and Nepal, not to battle demons, but to establish sacred sites that will protect Buddhism's future. Where he demonstrated power, she built systems. Nyingma tradition recounts her traveling to dozens of locations: Yamalung Cave carved into sheer cliff walls, Chimpu Hermitage where wind howls through narrow passes, Tidro itself, where she trained for 12 years, each site becoming a node in a network. Traditional accounts describe her encountering local spirits who had resisted Buddhism at each location. She offered them the same choice Padmasambhava had pioneered: protect these teachings and transcend suffering. Oppose them and remain as you are. Again and again, resistance became protection. The spirits who had fought Buddhism were bound by oath and transformed into its guardians. But here's the strategic brilliance. She's not just converting demons for immediate protection. She's building Buddhism's defense system for centuries ahead. Every sacred site becomes a refuge. When persecution comes, and Padmasambhava has prophesied it will come, these locations will be where Buddhism hides and survives. She's planning for crises 200, 300, 500 years into the future. And while she's traveling across the Himalayas, establishing these sites, she's also doing something equally crucial: writing everything down. Traditional sources attribute to her the biography of Padmasambhava. Without her records, much of what we know about him would be lost: his teachings, his methods, his transformations. She's recording the teachings, translating them from Sanskrit to Tibetan, making them accessible to future generations. His prophecies, rituals, meditation practices, she becomes the living archive, not just practicing the Dharma, but preserving it. Then Padmasambhava tells her the prophecy that changes everything. Buddhism will be nearly destroyed in Tibet. Within a century of our deaths, monasteries will burn, masters will be killed, texts will be lost, unless we hide it so perfectly that only the right people can find it, centuries from now. And this brings us to her greatest achievement, the one that ensured the lineage survived: the Terma system. Up to this point, Yeshe Tsogyal has done what masters do: trained in isolation, transformed spiritually, mastered the practices, established sacred sites, preserved the teachings. But this is the moment she becomes historically indispensable. Because Enlightenment changed her life, the Terma system changed the future of Buddhism itself. Padmasambhava has foreseen the future, and the future of Tibetan Buddhism is dark. Within a century of their deaths, King Langdharma will try to eliminate Buddhism entirely. Monasteries will be destroyed, monks will be killed, sacred texts will be burned. Buddhism will nearly vanish from Tibet unless they do something unprecedented. Yeshe Tsogyal's answer was so brilliant, so unprecedented, that for the tradition, the system she helped build is still alive 1,200 years later. Padmasambhava conceives the system, but Yeshe Tsogyal executes it. Together, they create the Terma system, treasure teachings. They hide over 100 termas across the Himalayas, not randomly but strategically, each one matched to a specific future need. Nyingma sources describe three main types: earth termas, physical objects sealed in caves, rocks, lakes; mind termas, teachings encoded in consciousness, awakening in future students at the destined moment; pure vision termas, revealed through meditation and dreams. Each one spiritually locked, discoverable only by the right person at the exact right time. Some were even written in symbolic Dakini script, a sacred code that only the destined treasure revealer could understand. In the 14th century, nearly 600 years after Yeshe Tsogyal's time, a Turtun named Orgyen Lingpa receives a vision. Nyingma tradition describes Yeshe Tsogyal appearing to him, pointing to a specific location at Samyai Monastery, telling him exactly where to dig. He finds a sealed terma containing teachings on maintaining lineage transmission during political chaos. The year is 1346. Tibet is fracturing. Lineages are breaking. For believers, this is exactly the kind of proof the tradition points to, a teaching arriving when needed, encoded 600 years earlier. Padmasambhava conceives this system, but Yeshe Tsogyal does the actual work. For years, possibly decades, she travels, climbing mountains at high altitude where thin air burns her lungs, crossing glaciers with fingers numb from cold, reaching caves accessible only to experienced climbers, sealing teachings in locations so remote they'll remain hidden for centuries. Later writings attributed to her describe the termas. I have hidden these profound treasures as a heritage for future followers. May the fortunate ones who have the karmic destiny encounter them at the destined time. Not for herself, not for her lifetime, for people 600 years in the future, for crises she would never witness, for a Buddhism she would never see. Years of brutal, exhausting, dangerous work for something she'll never see succeed, for people who haven't been born, for crises that haven't happened, for a future she can't see. And here's the evidence the system worked. 9th century. King Langdharma nearly destroys Tibetan Buddhism. Monasteries burned, lineages shattered. 10th to 11th century. The first termas are discovered, each containing teachings perfectly suited for that historical moment. Buddhism begins to revive. 12th to 14th century. Major terma revelations, new lineages form. Tibetan Buddhism flourishes again. 17th to 19th century. More discoveries during upheaval, each terma arriving exactly when needed. 20th to 21st century. Even after Chinese occupation, even after the Dalai Lama's exile, the terma tradition continues. The reason Tibetan Buddhism exists today, the reason you can practice meditation, read sutras, learn from Tibetan masters, is because a woman 1,200 years ago looked into a future she would never see and refused to let the teachings die. She didn't just achieve enlightenment for herself, she saved it for millions of people she would never meet, people living centuries after her death, people in countries that didn't exist when she was alive, people speaking languages she never heard. People like us. And then, after decades of this work, teaching, writing, hiding, traveling, transforming, she disappeared into the mountains one final time. After approximately 99 years of life, longer than almost anyone in 8th century Tibet, Yeshe Tsogyal retreated into the mountains for the final time. What Tibetan sources describe next is unprecedented. Multiple traditional accounts describe that during deep meditation, her physical body began to dissolve, not decay, but dissolve into pure rainbow light. No death, no corpse, no decomposition. Legend says only her hair and nails remained. Everything else transformed into luminous energy. This is called rainbow body, Jalu in Tibetan. Tibetan tradition holds she was the first person in Tibet to achieve this, the highest sign of realization in Dzogchen practice. Literal or symbolic, it represents complete transformation. The girl who started as property, sold at 13 to prevent a war, ended as consciousness itself. In Vajrayana tradition, rainbow body represents the complete realization of the path, transcending physical limitation entirely, mastering death itself. Not the body becoming immortal. The wisdom, the teachings, the impact. Tibetan tradition holds she didn't actually die. She achieved immortal rainbow body form, can manifest when needed, appears to tertuns in visions to guide them to hidden termas. Practitioners report feeling her presence at sacred sites. Tibetan masters say she's still teaching, just not in physical form. Why does any of this matter to you, right now? Padmasambhava brought Buddhism to Tibet. We told that story. Yeshe Tsogyal ensured the lineage survived. That's this story. She converted local spirits into protectors across the Himalayas, created a network of sacred sites that became refuges during persecution, recorded Padmasambhava's biography and teachings, developed the Terma system that protected the Dharma in Tibet through centuries of destruction, and became the first Tibetan to achieve rainbow body. Without her work, it's hard to imagine Tibetan Buddhism surviving in the same way. Child bride at 13, one of the most important figures in Tibetan Buddhist history. She didn't do it by defeating anyone, or competing with masters, or overthrowing the system that oppressed her. She transcended it entirely. The people who changed your life, the teachers who showed you how to think, the artists who shaped your worldview, the activists who built movements you benefit from today, most of them you don't know their names, but you're living in the world they created. Yeshe Tsogyal built Tibetan Buddhism's survival system. No credit for centuries, no recognition during her lifetime, just the work. Not what you achieve for yourself, what you preserve for others. That's the teaching. The 13-year-old girl traded like cattle to prevent a war built the system that kept Buddhism alive through centuries. Her body dissolved into light. Her work did the opposite. It stayed, it spread, it kept the teachings alive. Call it legend, call it devotion, call it sacred history. Its impact is real. If this story changed how you think about legacy, impact, or what one person can accomplish with vision and dedication, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more untold stories from Buddhist history, we've covered Tara, we've covered Padmasambhava, now you know Yeshe Tsogyal. There are more stories like this. Subscribe, hit the bell, we're just getting started. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, stay wise.